All right, so today we're going to learn about React, Vue, and Svelte, and I'm going to use the medium of teen movies to draw analogies. This is going to be a very high-level overview, so unfortunately I won't teach you how to write in any of these, but hopefully it will give you a good understanding of the ways in which they're similar and different. Okay, so I wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. The conference is taking place on native Hawaiian land. Queen Liliuokalani was signed over sovereignty of the islands to the US under duress in order to save her people from violence. Native Hawaiians have been stewards of the land and its abundant biodiversity for centuries, which is why we can enjoy it today. And I am of the personal opinion that sovereignty should be returned. Okay, so who am I? I'm Leta. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm an instructor at the Turing School of Software and Design in Denver, Colorado. We're a nonprofit code school that in 7 months takes professionals who are transitioning into tech and trains them to be job-ready junior developers. The reason I'm qualified to give this talk is, as an instructor, I teach my students the ins and outs of JavaScript. I also teach mostly React. I'm mostly a React developer. So if there's any lies I tell you about Vue and Svelte, I'm very sorry. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be learning together. And because learning requires both vulnerability and trust with each other, I'll go first by being very vulnerable and sharing with you a photo of me from high school. And you can see that young Leta was very nerdy. My favorite activities in high school was being part of the competitive marching band. We had 2 marching bands, and I was in the competitive one. Some of my favorite movies at the time were Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You and Empire Records. And I really believe that teen movies, the stories they're actually telling are just about the lesson that we all should learn, which is people are more than what they seem. And because of this messaging, that seems like a great way to start talking about these different frameworks, so we can really dig in and get past our basic understanding of what they are. Okay, so we're going to be talking about React and Vue and Svelte today, and again, it's going to be from a very high level. So starting with React, React is like the big swaggery jock who everybody knows, and like it's really easy to be like, oh, they're kind of like a bully, they make you do things their way, but then it turns out like they actually really care and they just want to make things easier for you, and like they learn how to listen. So let's dive a little more into that. React, super popular. Even if you don't personally write React, you probably have heard of React. It can be hard to get to know React at first. There's a lot of like blog posts and stories and rumors about them. Like, I heard React's hair is insured for $10,000. React takes up a lot of room. When React comes into the cafeteria, like you always know they're there. React has like its own language. It's always using strange slang like offsides and first and down and JSX. And one of the great things about React, though, is that it works with its teammates and really values them. And so it's always rolling into the cafeteria with DOM and Babel and Webpack, and they work together to solve things. One of the things that surprises people about, this jock who seems like very popular and knowledgeable is that they're constantly striving to improve themselves. React is always trying to get better, faster, to listen, to address needs. So they really care about being the best product available. Okay, let's leave behind that kind of sweaty analogy and talk about actual React. So React, it's like all the frameworks we're going to be talking about today, it's component-based. Most of the structure and logic, the data model, exists in one file. And it doesn't have to be, but oftentimes styles are distributed into a different file structure, so it's not all encapsulated. React, I'm not going to say we all know, because some of us might not know this, but React uses dependencies like React DOM. It requires Webpack to bundle up all its files. There's oftentimes a rather steep learning curve if you're coming from a strictly pure vanilla JavaScript background, having to learn how the virtual DOM works and using JSX. You can write React without JSX, but it's very hairy and more difficult, I think, than just learning the JSX. React, it's highly configurable. It favors configuration over convention. This makes it very flexible, but it does put a lot of the onus of deciding how things are going to work upfront on the developer in order to configure those things. One of the great things about React is it has been around for a long time, and so therefore it's well documented. Pretty much anything you want to do with it, maintain it, debugging it, there's going to be plenty of resources and blog posts out there to help you with working with React. Cool. We're going to move fast because now we're going to talk about Vue. So like, it's been really easy to overlook Vue because it hasn't been like super flashy. It's not like the bad boy at school. But as you've gotten older, as you've matured, you've come to value stability, dependability, accessibility. And so Vue is like their best friend who like, at first you're kind of like, whatever, took for granted. But now you're just like, oh, you're always there for me, Vue. It's great. So Vue, super friendly. It's pretty easy to get to know. There aren't a lot of barriers. Vue is very organized. Like, it wants to keep its trig homework in a separate folder from its history homework with all the rest of like the history class things. Like, it has separate chapter keepers for each class. All right, Vue can be kind of picky about how things are done, but one of the plus sides is that it's pretty consistent. Like, it has its one route to school, it has its particular coffee order, it has ways it does things, and it sticks to them. Vue doesn't really use a lot of weird slang or jargon. It's just kind of a straight talker. And Vue is also a great project partner because they'll contribute as much as you want for the project, or they'll like run the whole thing if you need them to. They're just really flexible and relaxed. All right, so Vue also component-based, but oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, everything you need for the component, from the structure to the styling to the logic and data, they're encapsulated in a single file. Vue, given that it's a lot lighter weight than React, it's pretty easy to add it to an existing project, slowly migrate things over, add one component at a time as you need to. It has a relatively familiar syntax. It's written a lot like HTML. It uses a script tag, it uses a style tag to do styling, inline scripting, and there isn't a heavy lift with having to learn JSX. There's a few weird quirks with like using the V binding shorthand and interpolating JavaScript into the HTML using our double curly braces, but overall it feels pretty familiar. Unlike React, Vue favors convention over configurability. There are ways to make it more configurable, but there's basically like a few ways to do particular tasks that Vue prefers. It's also been around for a while. Plenty of documentation, plenty of great blog posts and tutorials about maintaining, debugging, spinning up fresh apps, incorporating Vue into existing apps, etc. Great. All right. Now we're going to talk about the weird new kid at school. So there's always like, you know, the start of any good teen comedy, like the intriguing new kid who rolls in and no one's really quite sure what social currency they have. So like Svelte, it's the new kid. Seems kind of weird at first, kind of hard to get to know. But it turns out Svelte is just kind of like it's just a helpful dork. It just wants to be really helpful and okay, let's talk more about Svelte. So Svelte, it's a little bit weird. It doesn't really think the same way that React and Vue think. They spend a lot of time just observing things, like just thinking, kind of digest everything at first. But once they've done that and thought something through, then they're just like on top of their stuff. I shouldn't swear. They're on top of things really well. Despite kind of this weirdness and running differently, they fit in pretty well because they use a lot of similar easy syntax. There's not a huge barrier to getting to know them. They're just like, oh yeah, sit next to me here at the school cafeteria table. Svelte also, it tends to listen really closely. It listens to what you're trying to accomplish and then builds tools to help you do that very easily. Like Vue, it tends to be very structured in the way it organizes things. It likes all of the things in the right place. Like if you put the notebook in the wrong place in Svelte's backpack, it'll be like fine with it, but probably not the most happy. So, also component-based. Similar to Vue, everything's encapsulated for a single component. It's all in one file. So one component, one file. It's pretty easy to spin up a new Svelte app. You just run a single terminal command. You can also bring it in slowly into an existing application and just bring in one component at a time if you'd like. There is a very familiar syntax similar to Vue. It's written in HTML. You use a script tag to define your scripts. You use a style tag to describe inline styles. The styles, it's really interesting, they're scoped to the component by default. So if you have styling for a button in one component, if you pull that component into another page that has multiple buttons in it, the component styling won't bleed out to the outer ones. Pretty cool. The weirdest thing about Svelte is that it's a compiler. So it runs all of its complexity and manages all the reactivity at build time rather than during runtime. So it has huge savings on performance. And the way it does that is instead of having a virtual DOM or diffing, it just, when you write it, anything that needs to be a reactive declaration, Svelte will compile that into a function that looks for changes. So you'll be changing just one particular thing rather than diffing an entire component. It's pretty new. There's not a ton of examples, documentation. Debugging is still one of the things that I've found has been pretty lacking. There isn't a lot to go on, partly because it's a compiler. It's kind of a little bit of a black box. However, that being said, the Svelte documentation, super solid, like really easy to get into. So like props to the Svelte team because the way they've written the documentation and the onboarding tutorial, really accessible. All right, okay. Let's actually take a brief look at how each of these frameworks is going to accomplish a similar task. Okay, so let's say we've built a small app for figuring out who's going to be homecoming royalty at the upcoming dance. This is what we want it to look like. We have buttons, and as we vote, like our little indicators change to update as we go. So I have a couple of things written. Please excuse the very noodly code. I wrote this very fast. I wrote all 4 of these examples in like 2 hours. So, okay. Here's just basic React. You'll see that I'm using a class-based component. I have a brief hooks version of it, but I'll leave that mostly up. Our next speaker, Tanner, is going to be talking more in depth about custom hooks, so I'll leave that hook excitement for then. But basically what we can see is we have a class, an ES6 class. I'm extending a React component. We've got our constructor where we have our state object instantiated. I have 2 methods. We have the vote method and we have calculate with, and this is calculate with horrible. I'm so sorry for this function, it's terrible. But it's basically just calculating things for an inline style, which is also garbage. Okay, the voting is just using setState to update our state properties, and then we have our render, which is just showing our JSX that we're returning. If you're not familiar with React, you can see that the JSX is HTML that allows us to interpolate JavaScript by using these single curly braces to capture our statements and expressions. Cool. That's that. And then let's see. Here's it with hooks. Same thing, except instead of a class-based component, it's a function component using that useState method, which comes from React itself. And that allows us to hook up this component to state without using our constructor. Great. All it does is just clean up a little bit of the syntax because instead of needing to do like this.vote or this.state.votes, this.state.react, we can just say react and votes with our destructured declaration of these variables. But very similar, also have the return, have that JSX. Okay. For any Vue developers out there, I'm so sorry for what I've done to Vue because this is the one I'm the least comfortable with. Really quickly, we have the style component that just contains all of our CSS, which I don't want you to look at because I'm not proud of it. We have our template, which is just going to be our HTML that is going to be rendered to the page. You can see that we have these v on click vbind style. This is Vue shorthand for connecting our template information to our data information, which is going to be declared down in our scripts tag here, where we're exporting an object that has the information about our component, but also the data that our component is going to be consuming and updating. So those vbind, that's how we connect to it. We can also use these double, similar to React with the single curlies. We're going to use the double curly brackets to talk to our data object. Hopefully I didn't just lie to you about how Vue works. Okay, and then let's talk about Svelte. Svelte, similarly, it's just it looks like a JavaScript file. It also has a script tag, a style tag. Style, same thing. I'm just gonna collapse that here. And it's not, you can see that our template, it's not wrapped in a special element or tag. It's just HTML living out naked in the file. And that's because this is basically just HTML. Similar to Vue, if you're used to Vue, this will be pretty familiar. It has its own way of connecting, creating event listeners and referencing the data that we're going to be working with. The interesting part that I think we get to here is that the script tag, Svelte has made a really strong effort to just allow us to write regular JavaScript with as little extra syntax as possible, because they're of the opinion that the more surface area we have in our applications, the more opportunity for bugs to come in. So we have some variable declarations. We have some more variable declarations with this weird $: instead of a keyword like let, var, or const. What that designates is that the value of those variables is dependent on changing the data. So with that React width, I'm taking React divided by votes times 100 and then floor it. It's very hacky. But because React and votes are both in there, those values are going to be changing. So what this does is it tells Svelte, when those values change, update the value of any of the variables that use the dollar sign in front of them. Cool. And then I have a single vote function. Cool. What happens with Svelte is that it will run through all of this, translate it all into JavaScript, and the only things that change are going to be all the reactive things, such as these values and anything in the curly brackets here. That's going to have specialized functions that handle those changes. So rather than having to diff the entire component in order to look for a single change, when something changes, its specialized function fires off and runs that for it. Cool. Ultimately, though, each of those functions, or each of those frameworks, they just build a component that does the exact same thing. They all ultimately end with something that looks like this. I built all of them and they're exactly the same. So what does this mean for us as developers? Okay. Ultimately, there are a lot of differences between these frameworks. When you start getting to large enterprise scale products, the differences matter more and more. Maintainability, debugging, those become more and more pressing concerns. I've just got a brief graph up here which you can take a look at. Ultimately, what I want you to take away from this talk, though, is not figuring out which one's going to be the best one to build with, but thinking instead about how each of these, they're different from each other, yes. They have their differences, they have their different use cases, their best use cases, their different onboarding processes. But at heart, each one of them is designed with performance and user satisfaction and developer satisfaction in mind. Even if you are a staunch Vue developer and you're never going to spin up anything in Svelte or React, something that I gained over the course of writing this talk was just that kind of uncomfortable, sweaty feeling of being an adolescent who doesn't know anything. And it was surprisingly refreshing. It was great. Learning Svelte, which runs very differently than React, which is the framework I'm most comfortable with, it put me back in that space of being a rookie. As an instructor, I'm often feeling the pressure of having to know everything, which I try to fight because like, I do not know everything. And so being confronted with a framework that I legitimately, on paper, factually don't know anything about, it brought back to life a lot of the curiosity and the questions and the freedom that being a rookie provides. So I would strongly encourage you, even if you're like, Svelte is not the new thing, it's never gonna be a heavy hitter like React and Vue, definitely still try it out. Play with it, because it's really fun to be just like a know-nothing teenager with like your whole future ahead of you. So, you can send me questions, comments, criticisms, like verbal PRs, like please do that, please help me. Send me DMs on Twitter at Leta Codes. If you can't remember my name, I totally get it. So you can just go to thatpersonfromthething.com and that goes to my personal contact page. Other than that, like, thank you so much. It's been really fun to get to learn these frameworks and share them with you.